Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 64, Amazon Cedar Open Source Policy. And our guest today is Ricardo Suarez, Principal Developer Advocate and formerly Principal Open Source Advocate. And our co-host today is Julian Lovelock, Technical Product Manager for Cedar and Amazon Verified Permissions. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us. Really excited to be here.
Thanks, Mike.
So, Ricardo, I'll start with you because I'm curious about your title. You were Principal Open Source Advocate. Now you're Principal Developer Advocate. Does that reflect any kind of change at Amazon towards open source?
Not really, no. I think it's more just a reflection of different priorities that and what I'm focusing on. So I've been working kind of in tech for like 35 years. A good chunk of that, 25 years plus, has been on open source. But more recently, with the emerging technologies such as generative AI, I'm now refocusing on helping developers use these generative AI technologies. So I still have that love of open source. That's never going to go away. Anyone who's out there that's worked in open source for any length of time knows that it doesn't go away, right? It stays with you.
I see the Nginx t-shirt.
Absolutely, yeah. One of my first open source projects that I got involved in. Actually, the very first project that I got involved in was the HTTP server from Apache. And little did I know that 20 years later, I would be working with Rich Bowen, who actually wrote the documentation for that project. So it's like really weird how it kind of like comes full circle.
So, Julian, before we jump into Cedar, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here?
Sure, absolutely. I sometimes kind of describe myself as a career product manager, which is a little bit concerning. But yeah, I've been in the identity management space for 20, 30 years now, starting working for a team at a large systems integrator in that domain, and then broke out from there, started my own business, building out a piece of software that did authentication and authorization. Before even cloud was cloud, at the time it was called application service providers, if people remember that term. And then that got acquired. It came over to the US. You might be able to tell from my accent. It originated in the UK, now based in Northern California. Came over to the US, worked at the company that acquired that piece of software, which then morphed and got acquired by a company called HID. And then about 3 years ago, moved and joined AWS, where actually working on, ironically, authorization once again. So here I am.
Okay, cool. Well, Ricardo, you're the guest, so I'm going to start with you. When did you first hear about this Cedar project? I'm wondering.
Yeah, so because I work very closely with our open source teams, I kind of like got to hear about Cedar very, very early on, right? And so it really excited me because one thing I didn't say is that I have got some experience and background with authorization and authentication, actually. So back in the day, probably 20 years ago, when the web was taken off, I was working in early technologies, sort of building PKI infrastructure, built off iPlanet LDAP servers and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, this is like going back, and then you mentioned in the pre-call that around SiteMinder. So I was heavily involved in implementing Integrity SiteMinder, then CI SiteMinder. Not just in sort of big companies, but also in the company I was working with. So I kind of really liked. I found it very enjoyable. And I know it's really weird, right? I kind of enjoyed the whole I guess challenge of making sure that we could provide really nice and easy to use authentication systems, but authorization systems kind of eluded us a little bit, right? So authentication was something that I think I've been keeping an eye on it over the last 20 years, and I think authentication now, ticking the box, we've done. And so when Cedar came along and I heard about it, I thought, oh, this looks really interesting, because authorization is still a hard problem to solve, right? And it still comes up in conversations with developers that I speak to. So it kind of really piqued my interest, and that's where I decided I needed to get kind of like more involved in it. And once I kind of learned about the project, and more importantly, not just the project, the reason why we created the project, I was sold, right? So now I've been talking about Cedar at various open source conferences around the world, doing demos, that kind of thing. And I think it's a really great project that I'm hoping that even more developers are going to get to know about.
And Julian, when did you get drafted to work on Cedar at Amazon?
So I've been involved in the Cedar project since I joined Amazon, which is getting on for about 3 years ago now. And at the time, the Cedar project was maybe 6 months old. So I've been there since it was a fairly small baby, and was very much a party to the decision-making process to put Cedar into the open source environment, which I've been a fan of from the start.
So maybe, Julian, what you could shed some light on, why did Amazon actually create Cedar?
So we created Cedar, but we should probably just make sure we've got good clarity on what Cedar is. So maybe I'll start there and I'll explain why we created it. So Cedar is a policy language for writing authorization policies. What's an authorization policy? It's basically a statement about what somebody is permitted to do, typically within an application. So Bob can view Alice's photos, all members of the finance team have read access to next year's budget. All of those sets of statements that describe what in Cedar vernacular a principal is permitted to do on, in Cedar vernacular, a resource. So why did we create Cedar? We created Cedar because our customers were coming to us and saying, okay, you have this language in the form of IAM that controls or defines what a role or an IAM user is permitted to do across AWS. We need something analogous when we're building applications to write the statements about what a user of an application is permitted to do. Because that logic today, more often than not, is embedded within the logic of the application, within the code of the application, which generates, and we can get into this in more detail, but generates all sorts of problems. So we looked at a number of the policy languages that were out there. OPA is a common one. There's obviously Zanzibar, which is not so much a language, but a framework, if you want to call it that. We concluded that we wanted to build from scratch a new language called Cedar. We didn't call it Cedar at the time, but a new language for writing policies, because we had a sweet spot that we were trying to hit, which was expressiveness, performance, and analyzability. And we didn't feel that any of the existing options hit that sweet spot. So that's the origin story, if you like, of Cedar. We wanted to provide customers, and originally we were focused on customers, and then we evolved into making it open source. And we can talk about why we did that. But we wanted to provide customers with a language to write policies within the applications that they built that was performant, expressive, and analyzable.
So I want to get back to this later, but I'm sorry, Ricardo, did you have something else to add before I ask the next question?
I was just going to add to that I mean, that certainly holds true as well. When I've spoken to developers on Cedar, one of the things I start off with is like, how do you do authorization today? Or maybe even asking them, developers, to put their hand up. Who has built their own authorization system, right? Because there comes a time in every developer's life, right, that they're asked to do this. And it's surprising, okay, how many people put their hand up and say, yeah, I've built one. In fact, it's still being used in my organization. And so people really understand the problem space, right? And they also understand the risks that come associated with building your own authorization system, right? So it's definitely something that not only that what Julian was saying, I hear this on a regular basis as I talk about Cedar to developer groups.
Well, and it's interesting because Julian mentioned that it was customer demand for externalized authorization, but we'll get back there later. I'm wondering what were maybe some of the internal. But before we go there, let me just ask this question because it's quite interesting. There's a talk by Amina Torlak where she introduces sort of how they scientifically looked at and analyzed this problem and came up with a solution. And I noticed her title, I think it's like Chief Science Officer or something, or Chief Science Technical. I forget what her exact title is, but it made me think, I didn't realize Amazon Web Services had scientists. I was just wondering, Ricardo, if you could maybe shed some light on, like, okay, so you decide you want to build this authorization product. How does it connect to the science team at Amazon Web Server, and what types of things are they working on?
Well, I can't maybe go into specific details. I mean, we have in this particular instance, there are researchers that were looking in or helped or part of the core team were heavily involved in kind of some of the formal reasoning technologies. I mean, this is something that we have across Amazon. Actually, we have a formal reasoning team that, or rather, formal reasoning technologies that are embedded in a lot of the service teams we're using, and we don't use one in particular, right? So as a result of that, because it's quite a scientific approach, we have these research scientists that work on this and then help our internal principal engineers understand how they can apply this to the problems at Amazon. So we've got, I think, one of the first papers I read was from Brian Cook, I think 7 years ago, where he talked about how we're applying this to solve some of the problems fundamental to working at scale, right? So I think that at least what I've seen and when I've spoken to these principal engineers is that when you're working at scale, okay, and you want to increase the rate of innovation, you want to add new features whilst not breaking things, you need to take a different approach, right? And so this is what these tools allow you to do. They allow you to define effectively from a specification a way of writing software that allows you to test when you make changes. And so the flip side of this is that it allows you to more reliably make changes, monitor those changes, and have confidence that those changes have not impacted your stuff. And when you're doing, like, billions of authorizations per second, like in the case of IAM, this is really critical, right? So, and it's still quite a relatively new thing, because when you look at how this area for, say, formal reasoning is being applied, in other companies or other products, it's because there's not much out there, right? So this is quite exciting stuff.
Just to build on that, just a tiny bit, a couple of extra points. So the Cedar language comes out of the automated reasoning group within AWS. And from inception, the principle that we followed was that we wanted to build a language that's analyzable. What does that mean? It means you can mathematically reason about the statements that the language is making, in set theory and other kind of mathematical theories. So you have a mathematical model that you can build of what these policies enable you to do. But remaining within that scope obviously introduces some degree of limitation on how expressive you can be within the language. You can't, for example, call out to a remote system and get it to participate in the decision-making process, because you can't reason about what that remote system is doing. So that's been a big part of what the science team has been working on, is maintaining the purity, if I can call it that, of the language, so that it continues to be we continue to be able to formally reason about the statements that the policies are making.
Yeah, and another kind of aspect as well, which when I speak to developers, they really kind of like appreciate the value add that this approach takes, is that when you talk about trust and authorization, they kind of go hand in hand, right? And if you want to use an authorization system, how do you trust it, right? Because we talk, I always bring the conversation back to, would you, trust an authorization system that you built? Would you put your mortgage on it? And of course, the developers who build it, they kind of like go from putting their hand up to maybe putting their hand sort of halfway up to putting it down, right? And so having that trust that when you have formal reasoning be part of the development process is really, really important. So we can prove the correctness of authorization decisions as well as the analyzability of the policies themselves, right? So I think they're two going hand in hand. One makes these policies very clear to understand and easy for people to validate, and then the other one is that once you've got those policies in place, the authorizations itself, you've got confidence that it's always going to give you the right decision.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is that it's safe. In a way, trust is doing the same thing over and over again over a long period of time. And trust extends beyond the technical sphere into sort of real life, and establishing trust, you could say, is sort of the quintessential problem of the internet. How do I connect to somebody using bits? and trust it. So, but I think what Cedar brings is safety. So if I'm building this into my program, how do I know it's not going to crash or give me some weird results? And because if it's not safe and consistent, then it becomes hard for it to be relied on for security audit purposes to know, did this person have the ability to do this thing at this time? So it's not deterministic. So I don't want to advertise for Cedar here, but I think, one of the things that we liked about it at Glue was that it was a good compromise between the deterministic quality that made it safe, but also the expressiveness and the performance sort of together. We thought hit a sweet spot. But Julian, maybe we could talk a little bit about so Cedar, how long did it take from going from this idea, we want to do something, to getting to verified permissions, which is a formalized Amazon service. And what about adoption internally? So I'm just wondering about if you could talk a little bit about the development process. It must have been pretty hard to go from idea to product and to convince internal users to use it also. What did that look like?
Yeah, good question. So firstly, from a timelines perspective, first I should just clarify what verified permissions is. So Cedar is an open source, free to use language and an SDK that's posted out there on a GitHub repo for
only if usable by Amazon customers, right?
No, Cedar can be used by anybody. So Cedar is total open source, and that's a misconception that I'm keen to correct. Cedar is open source. Anyone can use Cedar. You can go use Cedar when you're building on Azure, running it in your own data center, whatever you're doing. Verified permissions is a paid-for AWS service that is essentially a hosted implementation of Cedar, fully managed service, where the service basically provides a store for your policies, a console for you to use it to manage and edit those policies, an evaluation engine that scales multi-region, millions of transactions, that sort of stuff. So that's the distinction between AVP and Cedar. Cedar is free, AVP is paid for. The timelines, Cedar, the exact timeline from inception to birth was probably in the order of maybe a year and a half. We open sourced it in May last year. The development and building out of AVP was about a little over a year. So we started working on AVP, 6 to 8 months after we started working on Cedar. And then we launched AVP and we announced Cedar as open source pretty simultaneously within a couple of months of each other.
And any internal users of
so internal users, yeah. So internal usage has actually been very impressive. We have across AWS and the rest of Amazon, north of 50 different services and projects and applications that use Cedar. The majority of those use Cedar through AVP, but not all of them. Some are using Cedar natively within the application. So very good take up. It is absolutely something that we use ourselves. We drink our own champagne, or there are other metaphors that are less pleasant. But yeah, it is absolutely something that we adopt and use ourselves, and something that the customers use as well, honestly.
So Ricardo, Glue is a big user, and so is Linux Foundation Jansen project of Amazon Cetto, the Java SDK. But I was thinking about the difference between a project like Cetto and a project like Cedar. Cetto is like, okay, we know what Java is. It has, vast, wide swath of adoption. But Cedar seemed like a different type of open source project that required more leadership and innovation. Can you talk about maybe some of the differences in these projects, and are there other projects that are like Cedar in the Amazon open source ecosystem?
Yeah. So I think, if we take a step back, first of all, the approach we have at Amazon for open sourcing things is very rooted in the organizational culture, right? First of which is customer obsession. So we tend to try and take a look at actually pain points the customer have. I mean, Julian's already mentioned some of the things that drove the creation of Cedar in the initial. And in the same way, when we looked at Cetto, I've done various talks about the birth of Cetto. Very passionate about it. The team do a fantastic job.
We love Cetto. Good job.
Yeah, it's a great job. But it was rooted in the fact that at Amazon we're a big Java shop. 80%. Maybe it's going down slightly with Rust, but we're still a significant Java shop. And back in the day, we were because security is our number one priority. We were in a situation where we were building the expertise to build our own Java distributions from source, because it was taking too long for us to wait for the existing distributions and the patches and security fixes. So we started very early on getting the expertise around managing a Java distribution so that we could very quickly incorporate bug fixes and security patches so that we could roll them out internally to our own systems. And obviously the natural evolution of that led to the Amazon Cetto team being formed and that distribution being made available to customers because they were telling us they had the same problems. So I think the first thing is that we look for opportunities where there's a customer pain point and we've got something that we can work on. And whether it's Cetto or Cedar, there are other projects as well. We've got Firecracker and Bottle Rocket. Bottle Rocket is an open source container runtime, which has a very minimal attack surface, which means that if you want to have a secure runtime to run and deploy your containers, it's a better option than some of the kind of the more heavy,
sort of like Alpine.
Yeah, well, it's not sort of lightweight in that respect. It's lightweight from the point of view it's a small footprint, but it's got things like read only file systems and there's lots of other kind of like security focused changes for Bottle Rocket and Firecracker as well. We work backwards from the point of view that customers wanted to potentially use this to run their own kind of VMs, right? And interestingly, what I find interesting is when we open source these things, how customers sometimes use these projects in ways that we didn't intend. So with Firecracker, even though it's used for starting up micro VMs, there was one of the big e-commerce sites used it to simplify their CI/CD system. So rather than spinning up a container, doing the work and then spinning it down, they were able to significantly improve the time it took to do each run of their CI system by using Firecracker. I mean, it was a significant saving on time, and when they were doing thousands of these things all the time, so we kind of look for those kind of opportunities, right? So where we can identify a customer pain point, work back, and then work on an open source project. The other aspect of our Amazonian culture that kicks in is we think of open source as a long-term bet, right? And we have this concept of one-way and two-way doors. And so we kind of think really hard before we open source something, because we want to make sure that we're going to have the people, the resources, and the support when we open source something, so we have that long-term commitment. And so these kind of things come together when we're doing things like Cedar, Cetto, and other open source projects as well.
So, Julian, I'll put you on the spot then and ask about maybe the future of Cedar, because, these are really long-term commitments, and not just the patching, but also the innovation. And we see that a lot of open source projects move to like a foundation, and they open the governance to the community. So it becomes not just that the software is open source, but there's a community process around how to govern the project. And hopefully that results in not just Amazon bearing the burden of innovation, but also sharing that burden with the community. Are there any plans or thoughts about how the governance of Cedar will shake out over the long term?
Yeah, so let me just talk about how it's governed today and how we manage it today, and then talk a little bit about long term as well. So essentially today, it's delivered through a GitHub repo. We have an RFC process, so anybody can basically submit RFCs to request expansions to the language. So then we have what we call the Cedar maintainers group, which is today a relatively informal group which comprises of AWS and other companies who have a strong vested interest in Cedar, where we collectively, meet on a once a month basis, review the pipeline of RFCs, decide how to prioritize them. And then most of that work on the RFCs that get built out does get done by AWS resource, but certainly not all of it. And a great example of that is there's actually an implementation of the Cedar SDK written in Golang, which was submitted by one of the contributors, StrongDM. And that is very much part of the project and is used by other customers and also used internally as well. So today it is very much already a collaborative effort. It's not just something that we keep tightly close to our chest and don't let other people have a say in. In terms of the governance structure going forward, it's something we kind of review on a 6-month cycle as to whether or not we need to change the governance structure. We're certainly very open to that. We've looked at a number of different structures under which it might operate. I suspect that is somewhere in the future, but I'd be pretty reluctant to put a fixed timeline on it at this point.
I see. So, Ricardo, I look at the Slack to sort of gauge the interest in the Cedar community, and I see around 700 or so developers on the Cedar Slack now. Can you talk maybe about some of the things that Amazon is doing to evangelize or engage developers in Cedar?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are. So I work in the developer relations organization, and so we kind of speak at many conferences that are developer focused. And sometimes we go to other non-developer conferences, like security conferences and that. But one of the things we're trying to get out there is really raise awareness of Cedar, because it's still one of those projects, like a lot of open source projects, that's really, really cool, and you feel really passionate about it, and you want to tell everyone about it. And it's still, I think we're still at the early days, and we're still finding when we go to these conferences that not everyone has heard of Cedar. So we do a lot of work at a kind of a top level, raising awareness. So we're kind of positioning it in a very specific way to try and help them understand, what problems it's solving for them, because all developers, like I said earlier on, they understand the challenge of authorization, right? They totally get it, and they're looking for answers, and especially in these developer groups that are building software microservices that run on different languages and different platforms, right, where authorization becomes exponentially harder to do. And so offloading that authorization into something like AVP or Cedar makes a lot of sense. So yeah, and some of my colleagues are also delivering content. In fact, actually last week, my colleague Sebastian, he runs the AWS Developer Podcast, and they had Twilio on, and Twilio were talking about how they're using Cedar and AVP as part of one of their products, which was, if you haven't listened to it and you're interested, then go listen to it. It's a really great podcast, and shows how their specific situation around making sure authorizations were there, running at their scale. Cedar was the right choice, right? And actually, I even learned something new myself, right? Which was how they built their authorization so that they can use AVP, but they can also use the AVP local agent running locally to offload some of the stuff locally, so that in the event they have a outage of network or something, they can still do authorizations, right? Which is really cool. So they're really focused on availability for their service, right? So we do a lot of hands-on sort of coding, sort of like presentations at these event conferences to give these developers a sense of how it might look for them, right? And without doubt, we always get great feedback, and we get some very, very common questions, right? So the questions include, how would you use this in a multi-tenanted application? Another one, how do you use this if I'm running Kubernetes? And interestingly enough, I think, I'm not sure if it was this week or last week, one of our Kubernetes experts, Michael House, he has kind of open sourced a new project on how to use Cedar in Kubernetes, which is available actually in the Cedar playground. So if you we'll share links for that maybe later on, but you can actually see what that looks like. So if you're using Kubernetes, that's available. So all these really cool things we try and get that out there and get more developers interested in it, just try it out. And I think this is the good thing, right, is that Cedar, from a developer experience perspective, they want to run this locally and kick the tires. And I've been working open source long enough now to realize that today they want to just prove the technology. And they get to a point where they've proven it, they trust it, and now they want someone else to run it for them, right? And this is where the on-ramp to using managed services like AVP is perfect for them, right? Because it's still the same developer experience. It's just that now they can focus on what they want to do as opposed to managing the underlying pieces.
I just want to very quickly, sorry, Mike, but no, I just want to very quickly just underline a point that Ricardo made, which is a really important point that comes across, which is that the open sourcing of Cedar is integral to the strategy of the commercial product that is AVP. So open sourcing of Cedar isn't going to go away because it's fundamental to our strategy for a paid service. And why is it fundamental? Because customers like Twilio need to be able to operate in that hybrid model where in some use cases they rely on AVP to authorize a request centrally. In others, they want to be able to pull down policies from AVP and authorize those policies locally within their own application. And so to be able to enable them to do that, we make it open source. So it is integral to the product strategy. It's not just a sidebar altruistic project.
Yeah. Right. And actually, I don't think corporations should be altruistic. I think people should. And I just want to plug my favorite Cedar use case I heard recently, which was Cedar for basically GitHub Actions, because our CI/CD process is really, really critical to trust, as you mentioned, and how we build the software and how we create SBOMs. And that is really, like, I think at the heart of the trust. How do we sign and deliver these trusted pieces of software, and being able to integrate auditable, externalized policies into the GitHub build process, as maybe just because we're software developers, but we really love that use case.
Yeah, that's cool. And a little call out to Common Fate, who built that. And it's another great example of kind of community build, and it not dominated by AWS. There are other parties out there that are building these capabilities, including Glue.
Yes. Yeah, we have an interest in Cedar ourselves. So, Adrian, I want to get you to put your product manager hat on for a second. Ricardo mentioned some of the challenges of reaching out to developers, but I see this as a multi-sided market where developers have this one concern, which is build cool applications. But there's other parties here. There's business owners who maybe don't care or don't understand how developer productivity works. So what are some of the other users or actors who interact with Cedar, and what's the feedback you're getting from some of those parties?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So the other big persona that we think a lot about, and this individual goes by many names, from security officer to audit manager to just security to other parties, but essentially that individual within an organization who is responsible for taking an overall view on how that organization's resources are protected. So I don't know, maybe you're a drug company and you're running trials on a new drug, and the compliance officer or the audit manager is very keen to understand who can get access to that data, who is able to actually see the results of this drug trial that's going on, because that has a huge market impact on the share, in that case, of that company. So that persona, to use an emotional term, loves Cedar because by externalizing the permissions into a place where he or she can go look at those policies, provides this really high level of transparency within an organization about who can access what resources. And when those resources are as commercially sensitive as the example I just gave, that is a big compliance concern. Can a compliance officer reliably and confidently get visibility to who is able to access what without having to rely on a developer to manually go through the code and figure it out for them?
Yeah. I just want to add on to that as well, actually. So back in the day, we're going back 1993, so quite a while. I got involved in
93 is before my time.
well, I was involved in building systems using something called Lotus Notes, which you may or may not be familiar with. But Lotus Notes did something at the time which no one else did, and they made this whole process of being able to create information and share information safely in the way that Julian said, right? In a way that even today, so I still stay in contact with people that I used to work with, and Lotus Notes is still being used, even though no one else uses it, right? And it's used in lots of public sector, government, or even highly regulated industries, because it still is able to secure information and provide that ease of use for compliance officers or regulators to see who's got access to what. And the fact that something like Lotus Notes is still running today, these systems, tells you that why we need something like Cedar, right, to try and take us away from those old systems and build new systems that provide that same level of confidence, right?
Yeah, and so actually, let me dig into that a little bit, because I think what you're saying makes sense to me, that by externalizing policies, I can show evidence of compliance of those policies. But one thing that I'm noticing is that a lot of companies, from a compliance standpoint, use existing tools like Avanta. Here at Glue, we use SecureFrame. They're great. We love them. But there's probably like 20 firms out there that do compliance auditing. And none of these automated services yet seem to look at externalized policies or evidence of policy enforcement. Julian, do you see that changing at all? Where maybe like we have maybe some very security conscious customers whose auditors are looking at this, but I would say the vast majority of companies out there don't actually audit their security policies. And is that going to change at all?
I hope so. And that was one of the big drivers for open sourcing Cedar, to put that IP in the public domain so that that ecosystem of compliance software providers are able to build those capabilities in those tools to be able to both provide the governance of the lifecycle of policies, who can change the policy, and also to be able to provide the forensic support for, okay, something did happen. What was the policy that enabled that to happen? Who created that policy? When was it created? We have a number of like smaller partners right now and startups who are beginning to build those capabilities into products that they plan to launch to market. And we're working, closely and hopefully with some of the bigger players to retrospectively build those capabilities into their existing products.
Yeah, and maybe it's like I saw a great talk about SBOMs, where they talked about it's not just having an SBOM, but like how much information you put into the SBOM and how it gets updated and created. And I see these SOC and ISO enforcements or certifications as the same. Hopefully, we can train the industry that it's not just checking that you do it, but it's what in there that actually matters.
Well, that's a whole can of worms. That going down the SBOM route. I mean, that we could probably spend another 45 minutes talking about that, right?
Yeah, I shouldn't have said SBOM.
Yeah.
Well, Ricardo, let me ask you. So now it's been about a year and a half or 3 years, roughly. I forget somewhere. It's been a while since Cedar was launched. What's sort of the feedback you're getting from Amazon and from the community? Is the team at Amazon happy with the progress? Verified permission, somebody once described it to me as a very esoteric Amazon service. Not everyone understands it. So how's sort of adoption, or maybe Julian, you might be better asking this, but basically, how's it going?
I mean, it's going well. Like I said, there we have north of 60 internal services and projects that are using it across Amazon. We have customers measuring in the hundreds who are using it, and it takes a while. I think that's one of the lessons that I've learned. I mean, permissions management is intrinsic to the application. It's not like you can slap it on with a SAML assertion and you're done. So it takes a while. It's a slow build for sure. But I've talked to customers who again, it's emotional, but who genuinely love Cedar, because it takes off their plate something that they don't believe in their hearts that they have the depth of expertise to be able to deal with. It's pretty easy in the first instance to, write a simple role-based permission system, but that just gets so messy so soon. You start adding attributes, and you start adding relationships, and you start adding customized roles. And very soon you get to a point you don't know what exactly it is that you've built, and then you leave and you hand it over to someone else, and they certainly don't know what it is that you've built.
Or somebody suggests you use JBoss drools, and then you're like, "Oh no, not again."
Everyone's got their favorite for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to go back to your original question, what the customers they talk to love is the fact that we've taken this off their plate. We have this term, undifferentiated heavy lifting, and it is heavy. And that they love the fact that we've taken off the plate. They love the fact that we have a team of scientists and engineers who get up every morning and think about the challenge of permissions management and build that into the language and the service, and they don't have to.
Yeah, and I get the same thing when I speak to developers. That I think for me, what I've found is that I always gauge how well a new technology I talk about is received by the feedback, the questions I get after the talk, but also the follow-ons, right? Emails, direct messages, and Cedar has definitely been significantly higher in developer interest and engagement than a lot of the other technologies I talk about. So that for me is a significant factor. Obviously, I want to do more and talk more about Cedar to developers, but we're a small team, so we're continuing to do that at scale. But yeah, so I think certainly. And my experience of working with other open source projects is that you have it's initially it's all about raising awareness, okay, but once enough developers start spreading the word to each other, I think then we'll start to see a critical mass of more developers kind of doing really cool things. And I think one of the things that we've already talked about is that we've got the really cool stuff around the GitHub authorization. So maybe a developer who had strong DevOps background, we've got people who are security experts doing some cool projects. But I think what I'm excited about is what are developers going to start producing and contributing to the Cedar ecosystem, right? I think that's what I'm really excited about, how they're going to drive it in with new, more developer kind of focused, contributions. I think that's going to come, and it's, if we follow the history of other open source projects, typically that's where they come from, right? Developers who like the technology, the core technology solves a problem for them. Now they're going to start contributing to that project.
Yeah, and unless you can attract a community, I sometimes wonder if it really makes sense to open source it. I think a community will coalesce. Obviously we are building a product to try and make it easier for developers to build applications quickly using Cedar. And we're building an authoring tool to help them author policies, and then a local agent that runs in a mobile app or in a web browser using WebAssembly. So we're building, I think, I am seeing a partner ecosystem sort of emerge. And I think ecosystem is important here in these open source in order to get adoption. Amazon's making a huge contribution here by writing the core engine. And I think that's going to create an opportunity for other companies to use this technology. Well,
just on that point there, Mike, because it's and you asked me earlier about the governance structure and what plans we had there. I think the key, one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that Cedar's eventual home is the home that enables it to build the strongest community, and that's the key for me.
Yeah.
Did you? We're actually hitting the end of the podcast. I like to keep these things around 45 minutes. Maybe Julian, do you have any last thoughts before we?
So firstly, for other developers out there, think about using an off-the-shelf permission system. And the way to think about that is start by taking a look at Cedar. There are others as well. I don't want to be exclusive on Cedar, but obviously I have a vested interest in nudging folks towards Cedar. Go look at cedarpolicy.com, which is the online home of Cedar, and take a look at what we're doing and learn from it and take part. There's a Cedar Slack channel that you can join, which is linked to from cedarpolicy.com. You can join that Slack channel and listen in or take part in the conversation. We'd love to have your thoughts.
Ricardo, any last thoughts?
No, I was going to say the same thing. Join us, the Cedar Slack community. You can go on the Cedar Policy online and actually kick the tires without having to write any code, and you'll get a good sense of actually how it works and hangs together. So I definitely encourage all developers. Also another thing is that we've got reInvent coming up. And for those people who will be there, we're going to have a number of Cedar sessions, including a new Cedar hands-on workshop, which is going to be really exciting, and it's going to get developers who are peaked, whose interests are piqued by this talk, to get actually more hands-on and building some cool stuff in that workshop.
Awesome. And reInvent has videos, so if we don't catch it in person, it's been great how those videos enable like a wider audience like me to go and watch them later. So thank you guys for doing that. Well, I think that's pretty much a wrap. I just want to quickly remind everyone to subscribe to Identirati Office Hours on LinkedIn. There's a link at the end of all my posts. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. We're almost there. We get special LinkedIn privileges if we get to 1,000 followers on the LinkedIn company page. Other than that, we'll see you on Thursday. We have an episode on improving bank mobile security, a topic in which Glue is really, really interested. We have some great guests for that Thursday. And thank you, audience. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Julian. And